Right, hello. Um, every once in a while I do a video. I mean, if you're new here, you might not have seen any of my videos on the legal system. Back in the back catalogue, I've got loads of them. And when I first started really doing this channel, I kind of really wanted to make it a little bit more about, exiting the the matrix, exiting the legal system that controls us, and how to deal with certain legal issues, so to speak. Um, anyway, over the years, I've kind of come to my own kind of understanding of what the legal system is. There really aren't. I I really don't know of many other people that look at it quite in the same way as me, but I'm sure there are people out there, and every once in a while I do come across people that think on very similar wavelengths. Um, but most of them, and in fact, I want to say most of them, nearly all of them, still are suckered in by the legal language thing and this whole trying to still interact with the legal system, so to speak. Anyway, I'm gonna discuss some of this stuff now because, like I said, over the past few months, or at least very recently, I've seen there's been several little bits and pieces that I've seen, and you always hear people referencing, well, that's not legal to do this and to do that, and it's just like it drives me mad after a while when you hear people going on about this is legal or that isn't legal or whatever. It just drives me absolutely berserk. Anyway, what kind of spurred me on to do this video? I just got done watching one of 7-1's videos. Okay, and if you've been watching 7-1 for quite a while now, he's been talking about the legal system, and he makes this connection with the placenta and the birth certificate. And um, I'm not really gelling with his idea there about the way all that stuff works. I'm not really 100% sure really how to even explain what he's even saying. But it is something to do with when you're born. Obviously, the baby comes out, the afterbirth also comes out, and there is some kind of abandonment issue, and your mother signed you over to the state via the birth certificate and via the placenta and something else. So I'm not really 100% sure of what he's really talking about. Needless to say, though, I'm glad that there's some other people out there. I wish more channels like his, and he's got quite a few subscribers as well. I wish more channels would talk about this stuff and put videos out about the legal system and potentially coming out of it, or at least understanding how it's supposed to work. And once you understand the system, you can be free of it. Anyway, what where do I go from here? Anyway, go check his video out because he's got some really cool connections with Back to the Future and St. Martin, and Back to the Future's got tons of references to birth and rebirth in it. So it's just interesting that he's also picking up on this sort of stuff as well in here in Back to the Future. I want to start talking about. So he sets off. He's talking about the birth certificate, and I've actually got what I got up here. I actually really got into the whole thing because of property tax. I really started looking into the legal system because of this whole idea of property tax. And the thing that got me with property tax was this idea that if you didn't pay your taxes, that somehow these people, that operate out of the clock tower, the city hall, which is the clock tower in Back to the Future, these people that operate out of that place can just come along and kick you out of your home and sell it from out underneath you if you don't pay them. So anyway, when you start looking at that, you have to sort of step back and you have to break apart the reasoning behind the system, behind the legal system, and how it actually works and why it actually works. Okay, now I think what 7.1 was talking about is that because they have this birth certificate written out, let's go to a birth certificate, because they have a birth certificate written out that is based off of, I don't know, the placenta or something, that is, part of a connection to you, or was part of a connection to you, that somehow they can have control of you, or somehow you have to claim that thing back. And to me, this is not quite correct thinking on how the legal system works. So the first place to start is actually one of my early videos, and I actually dropped it in another 7.1 comment section. Not this last video, but the one before. And it's this idea of, like, if you want to explain how the system works, imagine a game of Monopoly, right? And imagine your friend has this game of Monopoly, and instead of like the little car and the dog and the top hat, all those player pieces, the little counters that you use as player identities, imagine those things were just little stick men with a picture of your head and all your friends that are going to play that game stuck on it. So you go to your friend's house and he's made all these little people to go around the board, right, with your individual picture on it. So well, that's got to be me because that looks just like me, this little stick man, right? So this is the example. He just makes just some cocktail sticks or some matchsticks or something, little guys like this, and then there's this photograph up here of of one of you, yeah. And so you look at this photograph and you say, well, that's me, right? But your friend made that, yeah. Your friend had taken the photograph and made the little stick man and put the little photograph on the stick man, and then you're all sitting down for a game of Monopoly at his house. So you've gone into his house, you've sat down for a game of Monopoly, and you've picked up your little player that looks just like you, and now you're playing Monopoly. You're exchanging money, funny money. That's what we do in the real world as well. You're exchanging title deeds for things, okay, and you're going around the board, right? This is essentially what the legal system is. It's just a place where you can interact with other supposed fictional characters. Yeah, that's what the legal system is. Now, when you get up to leave, right, your friend's house, you don't take that playing card with you. Yeah. Now, if you want, you might say, "Ooh, that was really cool. I want to remember this playing card." Right, or this little player, I said playing card, this little player dude, and you might go ahead and take your phone and take a picture of that playing card. So you take a copy of it. So you make a copy, of that playing card, right? Now, what you think is, you get up, you leave, you can take your little picture on your phone with you of the playing card, but you don't actually take the playing card, the little stick man that your friend made, because he made that. He took the picture and made the little playing card for his game. That goes in with his Monopoly game that you went and sat down and you played for a little while. This is exactly how the legal system works. The only problem is, like, if you had one of your friends sitting on the game and he decided he was going to be, let's say he was going to be the banker, and not only that, but if you didn't pay, he was going to make you pay. Now, right? So in the game, you're going around, right? And this is where the belief system, people's belief system starts taking over, and they believe that they're this thing. And then the bankers or the people in charge believe that they have the authority to not only control this little thing here, but also the guy that's actually holding the copy. Because, well, this thing is the same as the guy that's holding the copy, the real guy, and you didn't pay in the game, we need, you ran out of Monopoly money. So what that means is you need to go into the real world, find some more Monopoly money, right? So you've got to go out there, find some more real Monopoly money, and then play it back into the game. Yeah. I don't know if you're understanding this. but there is a belief system, and people believe that they are this thing, right? And I know it, I get it. People understand that, oh, you're not the birth certificate, you're not the birth certificate. But the problem is, people just don't realize. They still, even though I hear it on a daily basis, not a daily basis, but I hear people say, well, I'm not really the birth certificate. But you do believe, or most people believe, that the people write the rules, that write the rules for this thing, have those rules apply to you because you think you're this thing, right? Anytime somebody says legal this, legal that, I'm just like, oh my goodness, that's written. That legal law is written for this, yeah. With that, this, yeah. The certificate. Actually, it's the whole thing. Okay. Right. Let's get rid of this a minute. Right. So we've established that this Monopoly game that you're in at your friend's house is the equivalent of going into play, the legal system, so to speak. And your little character, this little character, yeah, the photograph, the likeness of you is essentially this thing right here, yeah, is this certificate. So this is where people are getting confused for the start of this. Now, did my friend need a piece of placenta or anything to create this little character in his game? No, he didn't need anything. Yeah? All he did is he just took a bit of information, which was some light that was coming off of my body at that time, and took a picture. Yeah? So there is nothing. What he's done is taken a representation of the physical body. Yeah? And this is what this is. They just get some information. The doctor can fill this out at the hospital. Yeah? You don't even need it. They can fill these things out without you even telling them to fill it out. Yeah? They can fill out a birth certificate. There's people that have been into hospital, had births, didn't want to fill it out, and they still filled it out. There's been people that have had at-home births, never filled one out, gone into the hospital with a sick child, and they filled one out. Okay? The thing is, you don't even have to have any. I mean, they get people to put their names and sign shit on here and all the rest of it, but it doesn't really mean anything. Yeah. It's kind of irrelevant because they can fill this information out, send it in, and register that child. Anybody can do it. I say anybody, but they probably like it to be a doctor or something or whatever. Yeah. Somebody official, right? The point is, this thing that is created is not yours. It's not your piece of paper. Just as this little character is not your little game piece. This is not your piece of paper. And so when you get this thing supposedly back, your birth certificate back, what you get is this. You get a certified copy of vital record. Yeah, you get a certified copy. Okay? Even though it says certification of vital record here, yes it is, but it's a certified copy of that. Any document you have from the legal system will be a copy. It will not be the original thing. Now you have to understand why they send you a copy. When I was at the local town hall, county hall, discussing with the thieves up there about property tax, I tried to explain this to him, and one of the guys there on the board, or whatever the hell they call themselves, he said, well, I explained to him, there's a reason why they never send out originals, and I said, do you know what it is? And he said, well, people can't be trusted to not lose the original. I said, I said to him, it's irrelevant, because you can keep the certified copy and send me the original, and then if I lose the original, you still have a copy. You see, they don't do that. They have to. If you understand anything about natural law, you will understand that in order to have control of something, you must possess that thing. You must possess the instrument to have control of it. So if I want to have control over this thing that I created, yeah, I don't need anything to create this other than it's ideal though that there is a baby that was born and I just write down the stats for that baby on a piece of paper, yeah, and then I've created the birth certificate. Now I have to keep the original birth certificate to have control of it. It has to be in my possession for me to say, I'm going to do this with it, or I'm going to do that with it. I'm going to make this legal rule for it, or I'm going to make that legal rule for it, or that, or call it a legal law. I'm going to make that law to control this thing. So I must possess this thing. They never give this away. And it's the same with a deed. Okay? All a deed is very similar to a birth certificate. It's just a description of something in the physical world again, written on a piece of paper. That's what a deed is. Okay? It's a description of a house in the real world. Yeah? And what does the county own? They own that deed. They hold that deed. They possess the deed so they can control it. So they can then send out taxes on that thing. Okay? They can say there's a law here that says the name on the deed pays a tax. Okay? So that's how all this works. You have to understand possession. You have to understand ownership of something. Just because you own a property deed or a birth certificate does not give you, although people believe it, does not give you ownership or control of the physical thing. Yeah? Now, a lot of the time, at least with deeds, right? Let's forget about birth certificates for a minute. At least with deeds, when a lot of the time, if I sold my house to somebody else, the deed would also change hands at the same time, and that is a way of representing that sale in an official format, right? So most of the time that happens, right? But if you were to say not pay your taxes, what would happen is they would allow those taxes to accrue for a while on the deed, and then they would say, hang on a minute, these taxes aren't getting paid. We're going to sell the deed to somebody else that wants to pay the taxes. So what they do is they go to the front of the auction house, and of course they've got to go through a court process first to look official and everything. But essentially what happens is after you've done the court process, which if you knew who you were and you knew how the system worked and you knew this con job thing going on here now, simply by going into court you could probably get that whole process stopped very, very quickly. But somebody that doesn't know these rules, that simply stops paying their tax, they're going to be in a lot of trouble, because what they will do is they still may, even if you went through the court process, and let's hypothetically say that the judge was an arsehole, right? And he's decided, well, I'm going to punish this guy anyway. We're going to sell the deed. Now, if you go, right, if you go, well, I forgot what I was going to say now. So if they go to sell that deed, what they're actually selling is they're not even actually selling the deed even, really. What they're really doing is they're selling the opportunity to have a different legal name put on that deed. Okay? That's what they're selling. The right for you to put, if you like, your legal name. It's not really your legal name, but to put the legal name that you use on that deed. And so this is what they do. They take it down on the steps of the courthouse and they auction the thing off. and then the next person, they put the new person on the deed, and they've got to pay the taxes. Okay. Now the new person goes and says to the sheriff, this guy is in my, look, this is my legal property and this guy's occupying it and I want him out. And then, depending on, again, it'll probably go to court again. And then what should happen at that point is when the sheriff goes to get I would imagine they've got to get some kind of warrant, yeah, or to eject people off of that land, right? They have to have some kind of written thing from a judge. So at that point, when that goes in front of the judge, theoretically what the judge should say, if the judge knows, that, and I'm sure most of these judges actually do know how the system works, what the judge will probably say at that point, said, well, you don't own the land, you just bought onto, you just bought the deed, you know, essentially, you just bought onto the deed, and I can't help you. I can't send a sheriff around to take these people out of there. That's their land. And at that point, somebody else is paying your taxes for you, because then they will stop paying the taxes on it, and it will be auctioned again, and somebody else will try. And that's how that process will go. You know, I can imagine that's how that process would go. So I know we've got off on a bit of a tangent with property tax, and the deed and everything. But again, as I said, this is how I really got into it, was trying to figure out, well, how are we getting around this property tax thing? And it's the same with all taxes, because you'll hear a lot of people in America saying, well, this tax is unconstitutional, blah-de-blah, blah-de-blah, and this is unconstitutional, and that's unconstitutional, and all the stuff with COVID was unconstitutional, etc., 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 right? They're not writing those rules for men and women. They're writing the rules for this thing, yeah? The fictional person. So they can write whatever bloody rules they like, because it's completely constitutional in terms of they're not writing it for another man or woman. Okay? So this is how they get around this whole supposed the constitutional issues of anything they do, right? Because it simply isn't even really anything to do with the Constitution. They are writing rules and regulations for fictional entities, not for men and women. Okay. What else do I want to say about this? There is something interesting about, so going back to the deed thing, talking about deeds, there is something interesting with, back in the olden days, I'm not sure if there's anywhere that still does this in the United States. There may be somewhere you can get this done. I'm not really sure. I doubt it though. But when they originally started dishing out land, okay, what actually happened was they would write out a land patent, okay, which is different from a deed, because what that patent was, it's just a document, pretty much the same, you know, the same idea as a deed, you know, who's a description of the land, right, and then who it belongs to, who owns it. The difference is with that original land patent, what they would do is they actually gave the original to the individual that was taking ownership of that land. I believe that's what was happening, because if you go to try, you can't find an original land patent in like a county office or any of those places. There isn't any big you know, records office that holds original land patents. They all hold copies, and the original documents were given out. This is what I understand. It might not be completely true, I don't know. They were actually given out to the people that actually took on the ownership of that land. So that's the difference there, and this is why people are always going on, like if you go down the property route and you've got to go, you know, you start back on this land patent stuff, it's kind of irrelevant, because what they're actually taxing in terms of county, what our local county is taxing, is they're actually taxing their own deed. They've got their own certificate, and that's what the tax is drawn up on. Okay, rather than it wouldn't matter even if I held an original land pattern. I don't think it would even matter, because the deed is its own separate little entity. Okay, the deed would have to not exist for tax not to be paid on it, if you understand what I'm saying. So, of course, the system has overcome a little obstacle there in its quest for domination. Let me explain a couple more things, because I'll just go back to 7.1. Now, several months ago, he had done a video about, he read out some definitions in some kind of legal format for, things like products of live birth and so forth and so on. When I listened to what he was saying, it didn't sound right to me. His interpretation of that didn't sound right to me. What I'm going to pick up on here is the idea of the language that is put on these documents can only be known, that the true meaning to the language on this document, let's get over all this crap a minute, so that any of this language that's on this document, now, if you go down the whole legal road, people will really start talking about the meaning of language, and the different fonts that are used. Like, this is all uppercase, everything's uppercase here. This isn't proper the way you write proper word, in the true English language. This is not really the correct grammar here. This is all, they like to call it dog Latin or whatever, legalese, however you want to word whatever this this sort of uppercase stuff is. It's kind of irrelevant, right? Also note that everything's in boxes, and when you're looking at a piece of paper, supposedly within the legal system, if it's in a box, it's not really on the piece of paper, which again is just nonsense in terms of common understanding of language and perception, right, of what we're seeing here. So again, the point is, this legal language here, because it's written by somebody else, though the person that originally wrote this, right, will have an idea of the meaning of all these different words that are on here, and the symbols that are on here, and the way these boxes are constructed. Everything on this piece of paper has a meaning that is known by the author of this thing. Unfortunately, we don't really have something that says this was authored by whoever. I know it says State of California up there and all the rest of it, but we really don't know who wrote this and what the true meaning in terms of the metaphysical jurisdiction of this language is, if you can follow what I'm saying there. So what I'm saying is, in the mind of whoever wrote this, and only in the mind of whoever wrote this, these words on here exist as things that, they have different meanings, right? And if these words on here, if I have a little hidden book with all the definitions for everything that I wrote on here, if those definitions in my little hidden book, they could mean anything, right? So if I'm going to go and extort somebody, or try to control somebody, or try to defraud somebody, I think the idea here behind why the legal system does stuff like this is they use a very specific definition for certain words. Again, we can't really know. I mean, a lot of people say just go look in a Blackwell's dictionary and it'll tell you what it means, but that's not necessarily the case. Okay, because on here, does it say these definitions are pulled from the Blackwell's dictionary. No, that does not. Okay, so again, only the true author of this thing really knows what the definitions are. So the point is, if an entity was trying to extort another entity and wanted to avoid, let's say, karmic consequence for doing something against natural law, what could happen at this point is, theoretically, if I was to write in my little book, okay, if I was to write some different definitions in this little book to what this means in the natural world, I could absolve myself of wrongdoing. I could say, well, no, you should have looked in my little book for the definitions of this stuff, and then you would have seen what I was saying, and everybody else is making a mistake based on what's written on here, but my definitions were different. And that works. So that idea works as long as this thing stays. I guess, look, let's imagine that this is the house. So this is inside the house. I can't really put a roof on there now, but this is inside the house of the author. This is inside his dominion, so to speak. It's not really strictly true. It's really inside his head. But so these definitions are within his dominion. Now, if I go into his dominion, yeah, his definitions apply. But when he comes into my dominion, so into, let's say, this is my house over here, and he sends this thing into here, what definitions apply in this realm, in my house? My definitions apply. Okay, and likewise, if I just sent this thing into, you know, the common land of man, okay, what definitions for the language on here would apply? And this is how the trick works, is my own interpretation of these words would be the definitions, because we use descriptive language. We're not bound by a prescription, as in the legal system is bound by that prescription. We have very specific meanings for certain words and for certain layouts of formats of documents. The point is, when this thing moves into the physical world, so to speak, these meanings that are written on here can mean something completely different. Okay, or they could mean the same thing. We don't know, right? But we take our interpretation of this and we say, okay, I'm going to call that's what I think it is. And so when you get a tax bill, let's go back to the tax bill. So when you get a tax bill, right, and let's see if I can write on it. You know, you get a tax bill, and let's see what have we got here. Usually, it doesn't even say bill on it. It just says, I don't know. Here we go. Here's the payment thing. Pay only one amount, you know, here. But usually, I want to say, well, anyway, a lot of the time it will. Oh, it actually does. Well, it says tax bill number there. Well, anyway, it doesn't really matter what it says on it. A lot of the time, it will just say statement on it, you know, because they want to try and absolve themselves there as well of kind of wrongdoing. But you see, the problem is, right? So this thing says bill on it, and what happens with this is, as I was saying, if you don't pay this, it's almost a little gem, really, that they do this. Is that what they do is they send, usually either with this or on something to do with their literature, or if you would even phone them and ask them what would happen if I don't pay my property tax, they will tell you that they're going to sell, they will auction off your property. The property is not yours, the property is the deed that belongs to them. They will auction that thing, and they won't even auction the thing. All they're doing is they are auctioning the right to put your name on that thing. It would be very interesting to actually go to one of these auctions and actually see how they word what they're actually selling, because you might be able to catch them out on the language they use there as well. They might slip up. I don't know. They may or may not slip up because they're not really selling the deed. Okay, they are really selling, again, the right to go on it. But the point is, right? The point is that that's a threat. Okay, that is a threat of your well-being. Okay, so there's your duress. Okay, because you think, well, I better just pay it because I don't really want to get kicked out on the street. So if they didn't do that and you went ahead and paid it, they would be, in terms karmically, they would actually be, they would be fairly well off. Yeah, because they haven't threatened you that you need to pay it or anything. There's no negative consequence for not paying it, right? Nobody would pay it, of course. But if there was no negative consequence for not paying it, if they sent this thing out, at that point, even though it's fraudulent, so to speak, because the idea is that their language is now changing to a different meaning when it gets to you, because you're applying common language and common understanding of these symbols on this piece of paper, whereas they're using very selective meanings to all the symbolism that's on that piece of paper. Anyway, the problem is this then becomes fraud, because they're sending out something that has a different meaning, and it's actually addressing a different entity to the living man. Here's another little tidbit of why it's a fraud as well, especially if you do this little number. If you get your tax bill, one thing that you could do is send back and say, well, I'm not the actual legal fiction that you are trying to summons for payment here, or get payment from. I'm not that entity. The real original birth certificate, if we're going to go down that route, that's who has to pay, is in a room somewhere in births and deaths records, in a filing cabinet somewhere. I'm not quite sure where that is, but that's where you need to send your tax bill, because I'm not responsible for that. And then, so if you were to send that into them and say, I want you to not send this to me in my physical home, send the tax bill now to the actual original birth certificate. If you could just do that for me, please, we'll be all right. Yeah, they still won't do it. I've already tried that. they still send you the tax bill, but again, the karmic consequences for that is not good for them. Okay, because you've given them an opportunity to correct their fraud, and they continue on with it. Oh dear, I'm kind of going around in circles here a little bit, but so people pay their taxes because they believe that they have to pay them, and even if you're like me and you believe, well, I don't have to pay them, there's still this threat that comes along, and I know that the naivety of the people running the system, I know that's going to include sheriffs and maybe even some judges. I'm really not quite sure. I think low down judges, low on the totem pole, probably really don't. There might be some out there that really don't understand it. From what I've watched on YouTube, though, it seems like there are a lot of low down judges that do understand it, just from the language they've used in certain cases that I've watched online. There are a number of them that understand the difference between the living man and the judge knows who he has actual jurisdiction over, which is the original birth certificate. And a lot of those times, the language that the judge uses is interesting. You've probably seen some cases where they get up and walk out. A lot of the time, the people that are, you know, in the courtroom trying to deal with the judge, a lot of the time they don't really quite know. They don't really quite know what they're talking about. Some of them do, some of them don't, but there are a few that don't really know what they're talking about, but they still, you know, you might see a judge still get up and walk out of the court because he can't, you know, he at that point he can't deal with, you know, a real living man there. You've got to, before he does that though, you've got to kind of preempt him getting up and walking out or something like that by, you know, dropping some of the consequences on him as a living man before he gets up and walks out. Anyway, I know I'm all over the place here. Let's just do a quick recap. So they send you this tax bill. We don't know what the language is on it. We look at it and assume it's for us. When we know the trick, we know it's not really for us. We know it's for the legal fiction. Yet they still send this thing to the living man, straight directly to the living man, which means that it's come out of the legal system into the physical world, right? When it's in the physical world, this stuff on here means different things, you know, and that's the trick of why it's addressed to the fictional person. Not paying these comes at the consequence of losing your home, essentially. The way they get around it is they say, well, we'll sell we have the right to sell the legal property, which is the deed itself. We've got to remember that the deed itself isn't actually the physical land. It's just a description written on a bit of paper again. And they're not really selling the deed, they're just selling the right to put a different name on the deed to somebody else. Okay? So that is the threat. The threat is loss of your home, because you then assume that a sheriff that has a gun will come and kick you out of your home because somebody else has a copy of a title deed, yeah, for this that describes this piece of land, right? So there is your payment under duress, and I don't really know where else I'm going with this. I wanted to kind of touch back on the birth certificate a little bit. I think really it'd probably be a good place to end. If anybody's got any questions about things, feel free to load up in the comments. And probably my easiest way to deal with if you've got a good question, and it isn't, because a lot of the time it takes a long time to explain certain things, but if there's a good question, if there's some good questions in the comments, maybe there probably won't be any questions, but I can do a video to answer those questions. Okay, I'm trying to think what else I really wanted to talk about. I mean, the takeaway with legal language is that it doesn't matter what gloss what gloss they use here. It doesn't matter what they put on a bit of paper. Right? This is for them, right? The definitions on there are almost unobtainable, really. I really don't know how you would actually obtain correct definitions that are translated into language that you can really understand for a lot of this stuff. Okay, I know it's possible to sit and look at a Black's dictionary, and I do believe that will probably get you kind of close on a lot of the stuff, but again, it's not set in stone, you know, and that's the problem, is it can be changed, it can be interpreted differently, it could be, no, that's the wrong That's the wrong version of the Blackmores Dictionary. It's a different dictionary. No, this is case law stuff here. What that means, you know what I mean? It's very wishy-washy. And the point is, if I say to somebody, I'm gonna hit you over the head with a baseball bat, you know, if some guy come up to me and said that, I have to, you know, and he looked a bit dodgy, I'd have to take him at his word, you know, and either move out the way or do something else, you know. So there's that threat, you know, when somebody comes in and says, look, if you don't pay this, I mean, even though they don't say it directly to your face, well, they do actually. When I've been into the county office and I've talked to them on the phone, and they have told me, yeah, if you don't pay, this is what happens. I've been in there to talk to them before, and they've said it, and they've also said it on the phone. So, you know, I've even in that meeting, and I think that meeting they recorded that meeting. It's on YouTube somewhere. If I get a minute, I might try and put it up there so I can show you what I was went in and spoke to them. It's quite an interesting thing though, because what I tell you what a lot of people will say about this, right? They'll say, well, good luck with that. Good luck with getting them to, you know, not, you know, stop charging you tax. Good luck with that. Yeah, good luck with it. It probably won't. I mean, I don't think it. I think if the right person sees, when I say that, I mean like a man or whatever that works behind the scenes there. If the right man sees, like I've written several letters to the county officers talking about tax and, you know, the inappropriate appropriation of tax. If the right man sees that, I believe that I would stop getting a tax bill. I believe they'd figure out a way to not send me a tax bill if the right man sees it. But the problem is, everybody that's seen it so far, probably, I'm going to say, everybody that's seen it so far are so low down the totem pole, they're completely in the belief system as well. The same as everybody that's paying the taxes. Okay? You've got to get up, and I don't know which people those are, but they've obviously got to be further up the bloody totem pole than the low down people. So the people that really know how the system works, if it got in front of them, they would probably say, yeah, okay, those people were violating natural law. You could go back to the Declaration of Independence. Why did that work? Why did that work with? Did it work? We're at least that's the what we're told, is it worked. You know, they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and then I don't know how long it took him, old Georgie, to you know, come to terms with it and accept it. I think it was at least a year or so. You know, I don't know, and I'd imagine there's a reason why it took it. Don't quote me on it though, but I'm sure it took at least a year for him to accept that. And again, that comes down to cycles and you know, if somebody declares something, then it's usual to see like a year cycle go by, or a certain amount of time that's issued to that, you know, whatever's going on. But there's usually a certain, you know, like they usually like to have like a year cycle before something is kind of recognized as a sort of permanent thing. And of course, there's other lengths of time that are adopted by the legal system, and there's reasons behind, you know, if you're away from your estate for several years, there's a reason why they have certain time limits on things. Not to say, I'm getting a bit whiffly waffly here. Let me think about that. You know, it's a bit like, well, let me give you an example. When we was kids, we rented a field to keep. We used to ride horses, and we kept our horses in a field just a couple hundred yards away from the house. But that field, of course, was rented. We rented it off somebody, and when you are on something, and this is where squatters' rights and all this other stuff comes in, and renters' rights, when you're in, so to speak, possession of a piece of land, all this stuff comes from natural law. You acquire, if I'm occupying something, regardless if I'm paying somebody else, once I get possession of that thing and I possess it myself, okay, so if I went into a house and possessed it, once I possess that thing, there has to be a break in that cycle, with the natural law stuff, in order for you not to have a claim to ownership of that thing. So, like with the field that I was talking about, we'd have to get out of it for a month every year. We have to go find somewhere else. We could put horses in another field somewhere else for a month, and that it wasn't rented for that month. And what that does, it breaks that cycle. Okay, so this idea of, I don't know why I'm even talking about cycles, but again, going back to the Declaration of Independence, it is interesting that that thing seems to have worked. And my reference there is, of course, you'll talk to people and you say, we really need to learn natural law. And a lot of people, again, will say, well, what good's that? When's that ever worked? Well, Declaration of Independence. That's a natural law, so to speak, document. It's at least a document that references the idea of natural law. And, of course, it was eventually recognized by the king, So it does work. But it's one of those things where I think you have to keep on at it, and you have to, if you just state it one time, maybe you need to state it again. Now, I've written letters over the course of several years. Maybe that's something I should do, is, every, on the exact, right before the exact anniversary of one letter being sent another one, and said, I'm just retelling you about this. I already told you about it, and a year has almost passed, and I'm, restating this for the record. Because a lot of people will say, doesn't work, what's the point? Why bother doing it? Well, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. The point is, in life, you've got a choice, right? You can either try to walk on a righteous path, or you can just not give a shit and not bother doing anything, So, yeah, there may not be a point to it. It may not do anything. What it does do is, in my mind, and in the eyes of God, I think I'm doing the right thing. If I challenge something which property tax or a direct tax on somebody is complete theft, it's completely unlawful, and yeah, it's completely wrong. So one should at least explain this to people that are doing it, and at least try to get the situation corrected, even if it isn't going to work, because that's the right thing to do, and that's as simple as that. So I always get a bit upset with people saying, well, what's the point? There's no point to it. It doesn't. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. Ain't gonna work. Yeah. Well, if you don't try, you're always gonna be you're gonna be a slave forever if you don't bother even trying. It's a bit like you've got to buy a lottery ticket to win the lottery. If you don't bother trying to correct that situation, then you will stay a slave. That's simple. I think I'm pretty much done with this. Again, if you've got some questions on the whole thing, any of these ideas or whatever, um, I'll just leave you with a couple of ideas, right? You have to understand the difference between what is in the physical world and what is in the metaphysical world. What is fictional and what is real. Okay? And you've got to understand where those two things have jurisdiction and where those two things exist. Okay? Because in the real world, you have to have physical possession of something and rightful physical possession of something. You can't just go and take something from somebody. And again, that boils back down to natural law. And again, where this gets confusing for a lot of people is that a lot of legal rules and laws will overlap, with things that are within the context of natural law. Like, you don't go and steal from somebody, yeah? You don't take what's not yours, right? It basically boils down to that. You don't go harm somebody. That's taking something that's not yours. So there's this, you have to understand this difference between where the legal system exists, jurisdiction, where its jurisdiction is, okay, which is actually completely a metaphysical jurisdiction. It doesn't exist in the real world. The only place where it overlaps into the real world is when it takes on ideas of natural law. And then it can kind of coexist in the physical world. So when you steal something from somebody, obviously the legal system can deal with that in terms of fictional characters, and they can, deal with the two fictional characters that are, the injured party and the, whoever's the wrongdoer, and they can deal with those two parties and adjudicate things like theft and so forth and so on. And of course, when you get into serious stuff, they have a jury there as well to try and emulate a kind of a more dealing with natural law problems. And then when you get into complete legal rule stuff, you're going to get into just a judge dealing with things. Okay, that's your difference there. And so you get into slightly different court systems, yeah. Even though they're not true, even though you don't have a true natural law court, you've got some approximation of that in certain legal situations. Anyway, what else did I want to say? I had a thought then for a second. I was going to talk about something else, but I forgot what it was now. But yeah, you've got to understand this difference between jurisdiction. You've got to understand about ownership and possession. You need to understand, and if you can understand that stuff, you can kind of break apart the sort of belief system around the deeds and property titles, any kind of that stuff, the birth certificate. And then once you get into all that stuff, then you're going to realize that there's even a difference between certain legal instruments that you hold, like passports and things like this, driver's licenses. Those things, those legal instruments, aren't actually technically legal instruments when you possess them. Okay, so then once you get thinking about this idea of possession and everything else, you'll understand that a lot of what we call legal documents and things like this and copies of birth certificates and all this other stuff are actually not technically legal when they're in your own possession. They can't be. They've moved out of the legal system if they're in your possession. Okay, and then you get into all these ideas of like why a cop asks to see your driving license, and hold it and so forth and so on, and this idea of possession and things like that. So you can go even further with why the legal system doesn't work with respect to the problem the legal system has is it doesn't really have a jurisdiction in the physical world. It doesn't really have a jurisdiction apart from in somebody's mind. So what this means is it's very difficult to have so-called legal documents going from one place to another place and actually having any true legal meaning. I don't know if that. I don't know. At some point, I'll do a diagram explaining this, because you really need to understand, like, when you walk into a court, you're here, and you're holding a copy of a birth certificate, and then the judge over here ain't holding probably anything. He's behind this desk here, and there's this jurisdictional difference here, and you'll present something and he'll look at it and then he'll decide if it needs to be legal or not. Yeah, he can decide whether he wants to take some information that's been presented here, and he decides how the two parties behind the scenes are, how that's adjudicated. Yeah, so even though this stuff looks like it's legal documentation, it really isn't actually technically legal when you're holding it, when it's yours. Right? What it is everything behind here that's locked up is legal, that nobody can get access to is legal, and then everything else is just switching bits and bobs backwards and forwards. I don't know if that makes sense, but when you start looking at this, you will realize that actually even stuff that is supposedly legal and copies of stuff, it is nothing. It's all just BS, basically. What was the other thing I was going to talk about? Oh, there's one other thing that I will just stick on the end of here now, and this is another reason why this is something else you really need to know as well. Is really why the legal system probably was set up. It was probably originally set up as just a trading corporation, some kind of trading organization that allowed different traders to trade with each other without getting ripped off. Yeah. If I went sailing down somewhere with a whole load of wheat on board a ship and pulled up in a harbour somewhere to sell all that grain, and let's say I had a deal with somebody and they were supposed to buy all that grain, and then they turned around and said, no, don't want it, I've just paid all that money to get it there, and now all of a sudden I can't sell it, I'm up creek without a paddle. Now the whole point of the legal system is to have some kind of contract that guarantees that I'm not going to get ripped off. Yeah. And this is why the legal system is all to do with contract law. It's all about binding two men to do something. Well, you can't bind a man to do something. Why not? Because a man lives in the present here and now, and so he has this right to change his mind. I mean, of course, there's the honourable handshake, where you say, well, I'll do this and I'll do that. But the problem is, if some unforeseen circumstance happens where you're going to end up being worse off for something, even though you said you would do it, you might not want to do it, right? And in those situations, if it's really like an honourable situation where you just can't do it for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe you were going to mow somebody's lawn and you broke your leg and you can't do it anymore, right? Right? So there's a reason why you can't do it that's honourable. Now, of course, there's people that are dishonourable that will also change their mind on something and mess people about as well, like that. So the whole point of a contract, though, is to protect those two parties. So if one party changes their mind, which a man is entitled to do, for whatever reason, good or bad reasons, he's entitled to change his mind, right? To a deal that's going to happen in the future, right? So a deal that's going to happen in the future, this is what a contract deals with. If a guy changes his mind and wants to walk away from it, well, what's the problem? Now the other party needs to be compensated. Well, how do you compensate the other party? You can't go and take something from this guy just because he changed his mind. So you need to have a way to have those two things be able to interact without actually harming the man. So what you need to have is you need to have a fictional entity, and that fictional entity has to be guaranteed in some way. You know, like if you went to buy something, you would leave a deposit to say, well, I'm good here. I'll leave you a deposit. I'm coming back to buy this thing, right? The same is true of the legal system. You have to have your fictional entities have to be backed by something, and so many of you will have heard of this account that has millions of dollars on it with the birth certificate name on it. And there's a reason for that, because everything that birth certificate does must be backed. The birth certificate must have backing, right, to be able to pay for all his, if he changes his mind on something, he still must be able to pay for that expense that he's incurred, right? So that you must have, so those entities must be guaranteed. Okay, so if he says I'm not paying this contract, this guy over here can still get his money, right? So there are different elements to this now. This is where it gets a little more complicated, because in the real world, again, if I was to get, let's say, you were going to give me some apples and I was going to pay you X amount per apple, but guess what? I was going to get the apples a month early, and then I was going to pay you for the apples, later, a month later, right? And that was the contract, for whatever reason. So I get my apples and then I don't pay you. I duck out on my end of the bargain, right? Again, that just falls straight back under simple theft, right? So, or simple exchange of value that wasn't fully realized. So at that point, a judge can come along quite easily. A legal judge can come along and say, this man must pay this back to this guy here. He's stolen, essentially. Now, so I've given you these apples a month ahead of time, and then you didn't pay me, right? Now, what I could say is, I didn't get my payment, right? And now that has cost me, now I have incurred some damages because I didn't receive that payment, okay? If I'd received that payment, I would have been able to, I don't know, sell more apples, right? So because I didn't get my payment, I couldn't buy fuel to get in my car to go to the market to sell more apples, right? So because you didn't pay me, I incurred a loss of revenue, potential revenue, because you didn't pay me, right? So I have damages at that point. Now, in natural law, that really, in a way, that can work a little bit with natural law, but in a way, natural law is really just about the exchange of value, straight exchange of value, balance for balance. Again, in contract law, though, damages is another one of these things that can be dealt with. Okay, so damages can now be taken from that fictional entity and be paid. So now you can deal with, when you're dealing in business, this loss of revenue because of, or damages because of something that somebody else did. Okay, so getting away from just the straight exchange of balance there that didn't happen correctly. Now the legal system can deal with that kind of thing as well, which is a bit like insurance. Okay, so not only do you have the insurance of the transaction being fulfilled or the contract being fulfilled, but any damages that are incurred as well with that contract, that can also be fulfilled as well. Again, it comes down to, where's that money coming from? Okay, because you can't just go and, you can go to the man and take the actual value back that he didn't pay. That's quite a lawful thing to do in natural law. But when you get into the realms of damages, that's much more hypothetical. Okay, and that hypothetical loss is where you need to deal with that with the legal system, and you would need to have, again, those entities being guaranteed. You can deal with that with the legal system because you're not actually affecting the man, you're dealing with a fictional entity. So again, this is why that probably there is an account there with a ton of money in it. And again, this gets these people out of trouble because they're not asking for something that's not there. The legal fiction has the money to pay this tax. Okay, so it's not as if they're demanding something that can't be paid. They're just demanding payment from that fiction, and it can be paid. So there's no unreasonable thing to sending out a tax bill like that to the fictional person. Okay, karmically again, the problem is, karmically speaking, the whole system is effed. I mean, there's so many, and I think what it is originally, I think the system probably was set up correctly, where you had, anytime you had to deal with the legal system, you kind of had to go into a courtroom that was, or the post office that is, somebody lived there, maybe. I don't know about the court, but maybe there was somebody that actually took responsibility for that courthouse and was the master of the courthouse. I don't know if that's really whether that happened, but you hear about that with post offices. Maybe post offices back in the olden days had a postmaster that would actually live there. And so what you're dealing with is going into somebody else's jurisdiction to retrieve legal stuff. And if you're going into not that you can really go into that jurisdiction, but it's better than them sending you a letter or sending you a demand straight to your home, you see. So how that works is, if I'm going into somebody else's somebody else's system, somebody else's mindset, so to speak, then they can get away with this stuff on a karmic level a little bit better than what's happening now. That probably doesn't make any sense to anybody, but it's a lot to get your head wrapped around. It certainly takes a little while to kind of come out of that, the mindset and try and figure all this stuff out. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Maybe somebody watched that, maybe somebody got something out of it. But yeah, you've got to understand why that legal system's there and what that big account is there to pay. And obviously there was this whole thing in England with people saying, well, electric and water and gas and all this kind of stuff should all be free, and you don't have to pay it, and blah de blah blah de blah. There is a difference between when you as a man deal with another entity, whether it be a corporation, a government, or whatever. When you need exchange of value with that thing, you have to remember that the rules of natural law are still in play. Okay, even though you might be dealing with your supposed legal name, which isn't your name, and you might be dealing with a legal corporate name or something, at the end of the day, there's a man here and a man there that has to make those two things work. You cannot take something, you cannot steal something just because this is supposedly a legal thing on one side over here, and then you're over here, and you can't just, because there's this sort of mask of a legal thing here and a legal thing here, and these are the two things that are actually interacting. You cannot just steal from this or that because you think there's some kind of legal right there. I don't know if that makes sense. You're still exchanging value for value. So if I want electric over here, right, if I want some electricity and this guy's selling electricity here, it's just a simple trade. I can't say, well, it should be free, send me electricity and then I'm not going to pay. If you follow. There was a whole big thing on that yeah, there seems to be a big thing in that with that in England. I don't know if it's still going on or not, but it's just complete retardation. Anyway, I'm gonna leave it there. My voice is going. I won't go to bed. And I got a really good decode coming up that I wanted to do tonight as well, but I'm gonna have to wait. And apologies about that last one. It didn't really come out quite how I wanted it, but if you watch that last decode of mine, it was from the night of the thunderstorm through to the Super Bowl, 88 days. So the night of the thunderstorm takes you through and to Marty's last leap home. Okay, so imagine that point at which in 1955, I guess, that point is his kind of birth. That's Marty's birth at that point. Note that that's where the big 9/11 reference is. So that's like, again, what I say is like 9/11 is the actual birth into the world, and then coming out of the world, that crossing the Golden Gate Bridge there in part 3, that's coming out of the Matrix. And so we've got that, if you just go from last year to, well, this year to next year, we've got this 88-day jump from the night of the thunderstorm through to the 8th of February, which will be Super Bowl 60. And again, Decoding with Cody's got he's got a good decode on that to do with Back to the Future and the Super Bowl there, and Clara Clayton because it's in Santa Clara. And but again, Santa Clara's to do with the moon. Clara Clayton in the film is to do with the moon. It's the purples there. To do with the. I'm not going to get into all colours and all this stuff right now, but there's this connection to the 8th of February, and if you look at the 8th of February, what we have is the number 28 is, or 8-2 should I say, so 8th of February, 8-2 is our number jump, is our end and beginning of Lucas numbers. So the start of Lucas numbers is 2, 1, 3, and of course the end of that cycle, as you come back around, that number is 8. So 8-2 is the beginning and end of a cycle, and then of course this date is coming on 5 days later, okay, and so 213 is also on the dollar bill. It's a huge number on the dollar bill, on the date on the dollar bill. And remember, if you've looked at all my decodes with the clock tower, that will make perfect sense about the 88 miles an hour, the 5th of November, the lightning that hits the top of the clock tower is the number 5 and a 5 again at the top of there, and we've got the number 11 right here, 511, the 5th of November, all these little connections that we've had so far. It's just absolutely, I don't know, it's just absolutely insane. It's 100, what I was going to say is on the dollar bill 9/11, and of course this lightning comes across onto the other side of the street over here in the chart of Lorraine, and we have the 9/11 reference with the fire trail, right? So we have this 9/11 reference, and from 9/11 it's 155 days through to 213, and that's on the dollar bill. So this 8-2 Super Bowl thing is pretty interesting, because in iPet Go, as we see the Super Bowl trophy moments later, and again it's dealing with the Virgin Mary, or the feminine side of reality, so to speak. And so when we have the Super Bowl trophy there with the Mary figure, which is again the moon, Santa Clara, when we have that connection in iPet Go, then we have the mushroom cloud thing going off just seconds later that we see the Super Bowl trophy. So it's just kind of interesting what we've got coming up. Anyway, sorry to waffle on about that now, but I will do an actual video on that and talk about it, but I just didn't have time the other day, and I kind of wanted to try doing that video the way I did it. I could have probably got it a little bit better than that, but it's a bit difficult with Windows Movie Maker, and then even trying to find some bloody music that isn't copyrighted, and then that never worked out for me on that video. So my next one though, hopefully I will have a little bit more of a chance to get it sounding a bit better. Okay, with that being said, I'm out of here. Good night, God bless, and I hope you enjoyed that, and I will talk to you later. Right, cheers, bye.